If you're feeling overwhelmed by trying to edit your first documentary, you're not alone. Over 7 years ago, when I started editing documentaries, there was this huge gap between how to edit little videos for local businesses and understanding how to put together a documentary. Well, today I want to hopefully help close that gap a little bit by showing you the difference in philosophy, the difference in approach that a video editor takes when it comes to editing versus someone who edits documentaries. Number one, don't jump into a timeline. When you're editing shorter videos, usually what you do when you get back from the shoot is you throw all your footage into a timeline, find a piece of music that you like, and start cutting your video. When you're working on your first documentary, you might have many days of shooting over many months with many different interviews with different characters. So to throw everything into a timeline and expect to know what story you're trying to tell and edit it together in one go is unrealistic and is causing you a lot of harm and frustration. So what does the documentary editor do? They understand that they might not know the story yet. So before they ever hop into an editing timeline, they figure out their story first. Now, the most common way to do this is to transcribe all of your interviews. You create a big text document full of all the quotes from all of your characters in the different interviews, and you start going through all of these quotes and highlighting things, figuring out different themes that people talk about, coming up with different ideas that or topics that people cover, and figuring out your story in what's known as a paper edit, which is essentially an edit of your film that exists solely with these transcripts. When you have this story laid out on paper, when you finally decide to hop into an editing timeline, you're reducing a lot of that friction that it takes to get started with editing. You already loosely know the story you're trying to tell, and now it's more a matter of implementing that story rather than trying to find it within your editing software. Which brings me to number two, which is to build your audio first and worry about your B-roll later. When you get used to editing shorter videos, you rely heavily on B-roll because in the world we live in today, most of the buzzy content that we see online is trying to grab your attention visually. So as editors, we get used to leaning on different little tricks, cutting to cool music, coming up with creative transitions, maybe there's cool graphics, but none of these techniques apply to documentary. Documentary relies on different techniques to grab and keep your attention. And the biggest technique we lean on is storytelling. In documentary, storytelling occurs not through B-roll, but largely through our interviews. So the documentary editor, compared to the video editor, actually flips the process and starts their edit with only audio. This is a technique called the assembly cut. And what an assembly cut is essentially an audio version, almost like a podcast version of your film. You take all of your interviews, you figure out your story in your paper edit, and then you string out all these interviews onto a timeline with no music, no visuals, no B-roll. It's just purely your interviews. And the goal of this process of making an assembly cut is to make sure that your story structure is figured out before you start getting distracted by adding music and B-roll and all these other elements. You want to make sure that the foundation to your story is interesting enough on its own. If your story isn't interesting when you're listening to this version of it with audio only, there's not really any amount of polish you can add through visuals that's going to make your documentary compelling. So start with your audio first. And then once you have this dialed, once you've figured out your story structure, then you can start layering on B-roll and graphics and music. Which leads me to point 3, which is to make cuts invisible, not flashy. When you're making shorter, buzzier, social media-based content, it's all about being flashy. It's all about grabbing attention. In the documentary world, when you use fancy transitions, when you use, visual trickery, it actually takes the audience out of the story, because all of a sudden the audience now realizes that they're watching an edit, that they're watching something that someone sat down and crafted, and they're thinking about that cool thing that you did, or that interesting video technique, or that weird thing that caught their eye, rather than just being immersed in the story. So the video editor tries to create flashy things, tries to draw people's eyes to the edits, whereas the documentary editor wants to actually make those edits disappear. And one of the more common ways to smooth out your edits, to make them disappear to the audience, is to learn the techniques of L cuts and J cuts. Now, there's plenty of videos online about these two types of cuts, but just to quickly summarize them, L cuts and J cuts overlap audio from one clip as we cut to the next clip. So for example, with a J cut, you'll hear the audio from an interview come in before we actually cut to the interview.
And I had this love of climbing. I dropped out of high school and it was really just to chase after mountain climbing.
And this is mimicking the fact that when we hear someone talk next to us, we hear them talk first and then we look over. We don't look over right as they're beginning to talk. And so if you cut right at the moment the person's talking, it feels unnatural. When we add this slight overlap, it actually makes most of these cuts disappear. Our audience forgets that they're watching a film and they can let themselves be immersed in the story. So get rid of all the flashy transitions unless you have a very specific reason to use them, and instead focus your time on how to make all of your cuts disappear. Number 4 is to break it up into scenes. Editing a 3-minute film is totally feasible in one timeline. Making 3 minutes entertaining is usually not much of a problem. But when you start to get into 10-minute timelines, 20-minute timelines, even the 90-minute timeline for a feature film, waking up in the morning and looking at a 90-minute timeline and figuring out how to keep it entertaining for the audience, how to keep them engaged, how to hold that entire 90-minute story in your head while you're scrubbing through a timeline becomes a total nightmare and basically impossible. So the solution to this, what the documentary editor does, is they break up their film into scenes. And scenes actually have a very practical and pragmatic benefit, but they also have a very important storytelling benefit as well. The practical benefit of scenes is similar to when you break down an overwhelming to-do list task into simpler, more bite-sized pieces. When you're only editing 2 minutes versus 40 minutes, and you wake up in the morning and that's your task for the day, your motivation to complete it is a lot higher because it seems well within your reach. It seems like something that you can actually reasonably accomplish. If you edit one scene one day and then another scene the next day and another scene the next day after that, before you know it, you'll have a full-length 40-minute film. It's just only a matter of time. So breaking things down this way just keeps your motivation up. It keeps you going. It keeps everything within reach. But not only that, scenes also help you keep your film entertaining. And this is the storytelling benefit to breaking down your film into scenes. Because when you're focused on just a 3-minute chunk, it's easy to keep that 3-minute chunk entertaining. And if you have a series of these individual entertaining scenes, it means that you're keeping your micro story, your moment-to-moment story entertaining over the course of telling your macro story, your big story. So if you can keep the audience engaged in these little micro bursts of engagement and of entertainment, then all of those scenes will add up to a film that on the whole is interesting and engaging. So break your film up into scenes. It'll keep you motivated and it will honestly make you a better storyteller. And last but not least, number 5, focus on why and not the what. One of the biggest mistakes I see new documentary editors make when they're trying to bridge that gap between editing corporate videos to documentaries is that they focus way too much on the what of the story and completely ignore the why of it all. When you come from making event videos, when you're capturing a day and trying to create a highlight reel from it, you're focused so much on what actually occurred, what you captured through your lens, and you basically want to try and tell the best version of those events that unfolded. But the difference between a video and a documentary is that a documentary editor will dig a layer deeper. Instead of just asking what happened that day, they're asking themselves why those events occurred. In documentaries, we have more time to explore, to dig deeper into the human condition. And that's ultimately what makes people hooked to documentaries. It's why we're so fascinated by documentaries, is because we get to learn more about people, places, cultures that we don't experience in our day-to-day lives. And the only way you get to those emotions that resonate with people through a camera is by asking why. So a videographer, for example, might focus on a marathon that happened in their hometown and a runner that broke the local record. And that is their overall peak of their story. Whereas a documentary editor, on the other hand, is filled with all these questions about what motivates him. What is he sacrificing by trying to spend all this time training to become better and better and better? Who was he as a kid, and why did that shape him into this competitive athlete that he is today? What is he running from? Is he scared of something? Is he not facing something in his personal life? All of these questions are questions about the human condition. These are the types of questions that get your audience hooked, get your audience interested in characters, and make them want to learn more. This is the fuel for turning a small story about a local runner at a local race into a bigger, longer story that digs into a more human issue that we all face, that's universal. When we only focus on what happened in a story, it's boring. We don't care. We don't relate to it. But when we dig deeper and ask why, that's where we get to all the juicy stuff that people care about. So there you have it. Those are the 5 main differences that I see between being a video editor versus being a documentary editor. And if you're curious about where to start with editing your own documentary, check out this video here where I break down the process of turning raw footage into a documentary. That's it from me today, guys, and I will see you in the next one. Later.